Imagine you are a compliance officer at a major commercial bank in Abuja.
Oh, man. That is a tough job right now.
Right. So you're at your desk, a customer logs into their app, and they try to wire a few million naira to a supplier. A company called, let's say, West and East Africa General Trading.
Sounds completely normal.
Exactly. But instantly, your automated screening software flags the transaction. The screen just flashes red. Suspected terror financier.
Yeah, your heart sinks right there.
So your job is to decide, right, do you freeze this customer's account and alert the authorities, or do you let the money move?
You have to check the details.
Right, you open the alert, but there's no photograph attached to the file.
Oh, wow.
There is no date of birth, there's no corporate registration number, no national identification number. You just have a name. What do you do?
I mean, that is the exact dilemma playing out across the entire Nigerian banking sector right now.
Yeah.
It's just this massive collision between, national security mandates and the actual practical everyday reality of global finance.
And that collision, that's our focal point for today. Welcome to the deep dive, everybody. We are looking at a major development out of Nigeria from Saturday, April 11th, 2026.
Yeah, a huge data drop.
Basically, the Nigeria Sanctions Committee, they're known as NIGSEC, they released this sweeping list naming 48 individuals and groups that they allege are sponsoring terrorism across the country.
And we have a pretty thick stack of recent reporting on this to go through.
We do. We're pulling from Nigerian media, so Punch, Vanguard, Thisday, and Sunday Punch, plus the underlying legal documents. And we're unpacking this for you because it offers a really fascinating real-time look at how the global financial system actually tries to choke off the funding of violent groups.
Because making a list is one thing.
Right. It's like writing a to-do list for national security. It feels really great to write it down, but the mission here today is to see if they actually, do the chores. The actual disruption of a financial network requires a totally different set of gears to turn.
Yeah, and just to set a clear baseline for our analysis before we really get into it, the government documents and the media reports we're pulling from, they mention several really highly charged entities.
Yeah, they do.
The list includes separatist factions, radical sects, organizations that are embedded in complex regional conflicts. So we need to be really clear. Our analysis of these sources is strictly mechanical.
Exactly. We're not taking sides here.
Right. We are not endorsing any specific viewpoints or taking sides in the underlying conflicts. We are just looking at the legal architecture of these financial sanctions, how they're enforced, and what the data reveals about the government strategy.
Purely the mechanics of it. So let's start with the timing. Because, you don't drop a major financial sanctions list on a random Saturday morning by accident.
Definitely not an accident.
Barely 24 hours before this list was published, the country had just crossed this monumental judicial milestone.
It was a huge logistical feat for the judiciary, really.
Right.
The Attorney General of the Federation and Minister of Justice, Prince Lateef Fagbemi, who he holds the title of Senior Advocate of Nigeria.
Which is basically the highest rank for a legal practitioner there.
Exactly. He had just concluded the 9th phase of a mass trial for Boko Haram suspects.
Over 500 suspects were processed, right?
Yeah, 500. They had 10 judges from the Federal High Court in Abuja working simultaneously.
Wow, 10 judges.
And they secured 386 convictions on a Friday, handing down sentences that range from, 7 years to life, along with orders for rehabilitation and de-radicalization.
And then literally the very next morning, the NIGSAC list of 48 financiers drops.
Yeah.
I mean, so what does this all mean? That is choreography. The government is pairing a massive wave of criminal convictions with a targeted financial crackdown.
It's a very deliberate signaling exercise.
Yeah.
It really signals a shift in doctrine. Because historically, counterterrorism heavily favored, kinetic operations.
Military raids and stuff.
Right. Raids, border patrols, physical arrests, and the mass convictions, they address that human element. But NIGSEC operates under the Office of the National Security Advisor.
Okay.
And they're guided by the Terrorism Prevention and Prohibition Act of 2022. So by sequencing the release this way, the government is trying to project a really multi-layered security framework.
Right, showing they can do both.
Exactly. They are demonstrating that they can simultaneously lock up the fighters and dismantle the economic infrastructure that actually buys their ammunition.
Okay, so let's look at the architecture of the list itself, because the names are fascinating. It names 36 individuals and 12 entities, and the entities just immediately catch your eye because of the
Oh,
contrast.
the contrast is stark.
Yeah, on one hand, you have groups that, they absolutely dominate international security briefings. Boko Haram, the Islamic State West Africa province, which is ISWAP, IPOB, and the Lakurawa sect.
The big names.
But right alongside them, you have these incredibly mundane-sounding businesses.
Right, like corporate entities.
Yeah.
Settings Bureau de Change Limited, Desert Exchange Ventures Limited, Alpha Exchange Bureau de Change, and Sefikuvi Global Company.
Which I think perfectly illustrates how terror financing actually works in the real world. It doesn't primarily happen with, bad guys carrying briefcases of untraceable cash through the desert.
No, boring office work mostly.
Exactly. It requires currency exchanges. It requires general trading companies to wash the funds and convert them into usable assets. But okay, looking at the individual names on the list, it raises a really interesting strategic question for me.
Okay, what stands out?
Well, two of the most prominent targets that the media highlighted are Simon Ekpa and Tukur Mamu.
Right, yes.
Ekpa is a Finland-based separatist. He's tied to a faction of IPOB.
Mm.
And the sources point out that he was actually sentenced by a Finnish court last year, in September 2025, to 6 years in prison for supplying weapons and explosives.
Right, and Vanguard actually notes the Nigerian federal government is exploring extradition proceedings for suspects abroad, which very likely applies to his case.
Okay, and then you have Tukur Mamu. He's a Kaduna-based publisher, runs Desert Herald, I think. And he allegedly acted as a negotiator during that horrific 2022 Abuja-Kaduna train kidnapping.
A really high-profile case.
Extremely. The government alleges he collected, hundreds of thousands of dollars in ransoms on behalf of Boko Haram. But here's the thing. Mamu was arrested in Egypt in late 2022.
Yeah, he's been locked up.
He has been in custody for years. He's actively standing trial in Abuja right now. The government just closed its case against him.
Yeah.
So here's where it gets really interesting to me. If Ekpa is already sitting in a prison cell in Finland, and Mamu has been off the streets and in custody since 2022.
I see where you're going with this.
Right. Isn't putting their names on a new financial sanctions list in April 2026 almost redundant? Like, are they just putting famous names on the document to sort of pad it out and make the list look more robust?
I mean, I get why you'd think that. It looks redundant if you view terrorism purely through the lens of physical security. But financial designation operates on an entirely different plane. A prison sentence restricts a person's physical movement, right? They are in a cell.
Right.
But that does not automatically dissolve their proxy networks or freeze the bank accounts operating under their shell companies.
Oh, so even if the leader is in a cell, his lieutenant still has the bank login.
Exactly. They have the login, they have the authorization to move funds. Modern counterterrorism relies heavily on forensic accounting. So when the government formally designates someone like Mamu or Ekpa on a targeted financial sanctions list, it triggers a legal cascade.
What does that cascade look like for the banks?
Well, it mandates that every financial institution in the country must screen their databases against those names. It gives banks the explicit legal cover they require to freeze assets, block wire transfers, and completely shut down the corporate accounts associated with those individuals.
Wow. Okay.
So the goal isn't catching the man. He's already caught. The goal is starving the ecosystem he left behind.
Okay, that makes perfect sense in theory. The sanctions list is essentially the legal shield a bank needs to pull the plug on an account without, getting sued by the account holder.
Precisely.
But to execute that forensic accounting, the bank needs precise, indisputable data. And based on a highly critical report from this day, that is where the April 11 list just completely falls apart.
Oh, yeah. The transparency gap highlighted by this day is severe.
It's bad.
The published list lacks incredibly basic identifying markers. It does not disclose the nationalities of the named individuals. It omits their specific levels of involvement, or, in many cases, which terrorist organizations they are even linked to.
Just a name on a page.
Just a name. And most crucially for those compliance officers, the list contains no photographs and no demographic identifiers like national identification numbers.
Right. So let's go back to that compliance officer we talked about at the beginning. It's like telling a bouncer at a club, do not let John in. He is banned.
Right.
But you don't give the bouncer John's last name, his picture, or his ID.
How are they supposed to know which John?
Exactly. If the banking software flags a common name, The bank has to perform what's called KYC, Know Your Customer. But if the government hasn't provided a birth date or an ID number for the sanctioned individual, the bank is flying blind.
Completely blind.
If they freeze an innocent person's business account, they face massive civil liability. They could destroy a legitimate business.
Yeah.
But on the flip side, if they let a sanctioned transaction slip through, they risk devastating regulatory fines for facilitating terror financing.
It's a lose-lose situation.
It really is. The government has essentially handed the banks a mandate without giving them the tools to actually execute it.
And that lack of data creates major due process concerns, which legal analysts and the sources quickly identified.
I bet.
Because this isn't just an administrative oversight, right? It undermines the entire enforcement mechanism. If we look at the historical pattern, the government updates this list annually.
Right, it's a regular thing.
They added 19 names in 2024. They added Ekpa and various IPOB members in 2025. The list consistently grows. But the corresponding arrests, the actual freezing of assets, and the successful prosecutions of those newly named financiers, they lag far, far behind.
Which brings up a great point from Sunday Punch. They spoke to a security expert, David Bobelwow, who warned that without immediate asset freezing and swift arrests, the list is reduced to a symbolic gesture.
A symbolic gesture, exactly.
In fact, publishing a list with bad data might actually be counterproductive.
Oh, so?
Well, think about it. If you publicly announce that you are targeting a specific currency exchange, right? But the banks don't have enough data to freeze the accounts that same day.
Oh, I see.
You have just tipped off the financiers.
You gave them a head start.
Exactly. They will simply wire the money out of the country or move it into decentralized assets before the compliance officers can even figure out who they are looking for.
That is a really sharp observation. Which brings us to another huge bottleneck, the issue of judicial capacity, which was raised by another analyst named Aliyu in that same Sunday Punch report.
Right, because freezing isn't permanent.
Exactly. Freezing a bank account is not a permanent action that a bank can just take on its own forever.
Yeah.
A bank freeze is a temporary hold.
Just hitting the pause button.
Right. To seize those funds permanently, or even just to maintain the freeze long term, law enforcement has to take the evidence to a judge and secure a court order.
Okay.
And Aliyu expressed deep concern that the Nigerian judiciary is not currently equipped to handle the sheer volume and complexity of these financial terrorism cases.
So even if the banks manage to guess the right account, and they do freeze the funds, the clock starts ticking immediately.
Tick-tock.
If law enforcement can't process the forensic evidence quickly enough, or if the courts are just too backlogged to issue the necessary orders, the freeze expires and the money vanishes anyway.
It's gone.
Aliyu is actually urging the National Assembly to step in and create fast-tracked courts just for these designations.
Because a system that is overloaded with vague designations, but lacking the judicial capacity to actually process the underlying evidence, it ultimately weakens the law's entire deterrent value.
The bad guys know how it works.
Exactly. Financiers understand these systems deeply. If they realize their accounts remain untouched because the banks lack data and the courts lack capacity, the sanctions list completely loses its teeth.
This presents a glaring contradiction then. For you listening, you might be asking the same thing I am. If domestic enforcement is this clunky, and if the lists lack the vital details banks need, and the courts are struggling, why does the government keep churning out these massive sweeping lists every year if it's causing logistical nightmares on the ground? What is the actual driving force here?
It's a great question. And to understand the persistence of these lists, we have to pull back and look at international financial compliance.
Okay, the bigger picture.
Specifically, the role of the Financial Action Task Force, commonly known as the FATF.
The FATF, right. They maintain what is known as the gray list.
Yes, the dreaded gray list.
And for a developing economy, being on that list it's like having a catastrophic sovereign credit score. It is financial kryptonite.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize it. The FATF is the global money laundering and terrorist financing watchdog. When they place a country on the gray list, they are publicly declaring that the country has strategic deficiencies in its financial security regimes.
It's a warning siren.
It is a massive warning siren to the entire global banking system.
Let's trace the mechanics of that for the listener, because this is where it really hits home. If a country is gray-listed, it severely complicates correspondent banking.
Severely.
So, say a Nigerian manufacturing company wants to import machinery from Germany. Their local Nigerian bank cannot usually send the money directly to the German bank.
Right, they need a middleman.
They have to use an intermediary, a global correspondent bank. But if Nigeria is on the FATF gray list, that correspondent bank's compliance algorithms flag the entire country as high risk.
And then the hurdles appear. Consequently, the correspondent bank either mandates massive, incredibly expensive compliance checks,
Which slows down the transaction.
slows it down and dramatically increases the cost of doing business, or they engage in what's called de-risking.
Or they just say no.
Exactly. They simply refuse to process the transaction at all. It chokes off foreign direct investment and completely strangles international trade.
And Nigeria was actually trapped on that list until very recently.
Yes, they achieved a major victory in October 2025 when they were officially removed from the FATF gray list.
A huge deal.
Huge. But getting off the list required an immense bureaucratic effort. The government had to submit 6 separate progress reports demonstrating they had addressed 19 specific action items on the FATF's remediation plan.
Wow, 19 items.
And they also had to pass a highly scrutinized on-spot visit from FATF evaluators back in August 2025.
So they just managed to clear their name a few months ago.
Exactly.
That completely changes how we should view this April 11 sanctions list. It isn't merely a domestic security directive, it's a compliance deliverable.
That's the perfect term for it.
Paired with those 386 mass convictions we talked about, it sends a measurable signal to the FATF and the international banking community that Nigeria is actively maintaining its post-gray list obligations.
The government is navigating a really precarious balancing act here. On one side, they must satisfy the metrics of international observers. Publishing comprehensive sanctions lists and utilizing the legal frameworks of that 2022 Act, it proves that the architecture of compliance exists.
Right, it checks the boxes required to keep the global financial arteries open.
But on the other side, you have the grueling reality of domestic enforcement, providing banks with precise identification numbers, tracing proxy networks through layers of shell companies.
Managing the judicial backlog to convert those temporary freezes into permanent seizures.
Yes, the international community loves seeing the architecture on paper, but eventually the FATF will demand to see the enforcement data.
They want the receipts.
We do. And the sources outline a very real danger here. If the government relies too heavily on the signaling aspect, churning out lists with inadequate data while domestic enforcement stalls, the credibility of their financial security regime will erode.
Oh, absolutely.
If that gap between publication and execution isn't closed, Nigeria risks sliding right back onto the FATF gray list during the next mutual evaluation cycle.
Wow, we have covered an immense amount of ground today. We started by looking at just the Saturday morning press release and ended up unpacking the entire infrastructure of global trade.
It's all connected.
It really is. We have seen the sheer scale of the judicial effort required to process 386 criminal convictions in a single week. We've examined the strategy of targeting the proxy networks of high-profile figures like Tukur Mamu and Simon Ekpa, shifting the battleground from physical space to forensic accounting. We've also seen the critical flaws in that strategy. The missing demographic data that paralyzes bank compliance officers and the judicial bottlenecks that threaten to render the whole exercise purely symbolic.
The transparency gap.
And looming over all of this is the immense invisible pressure of the FATF, forcing the government to continuously prove its competence to the global financial system.
As we synthesize the reporting from Punch, Vanguard, This Day, and Sunday Punch Today, there is a lingering detail regarding the legal mechanics of this list that really demands further scrutiny.
Oh, what's that?
It is something for you, the listener, to consider as you evaluate how governments utilize these designations moving forward. Several of the organizations named on the April 11 list, specifically Boko Haram, ISWAP, and IPOB, they were already formally proscribed.
Oh, right.
They were outlawed terrorist organizations well before this specific financial sanctions list was ever compiled.
Which means it was already inherently illegal for any citizen or business to fund them, associate with them, or process transactions for them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which raises a fundamental question about the actual utility of the legal framework. What does it practically accomplish to take an organization that is already banned under national law and then formally designate it as a terrorism financier on a separate list?
That is a great point.
Does applying this new label actually unlock distinct, novel enforcement tools for financial institutions or law enforcement? Or, as some of the critical analysis implies, is this layer of designation just a bureaucratic redundancy?
Just a metric generated to satisfy the FATF's reporting requirements rather than a functional tool designed to actually track and intercept illicit funds.
Exactly.
That is the perfect provocative question to walk away with. It really forces us to distinguish between actions that actually disrupt networks and actions designed to manage optics. Thank you so much for joining us as we mapped out this intersection of law, security, and global finance. Keep looking for the hidden mechanisms driving the headlines, and we will be back next time to analyze the next stack of sources shaping our world.